Thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to be talking about environmental communication with a particular focus on sustainability, so environmentalism from a consumer behavior perspective. I started out as a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter for 5 years, and when I started my PhD, I thought I would focus on journalism, but I ended up being interested in consumer behavior and how it overlaps with politics, how we can be political or civic-minded in our marketplace choices. So that's how I moved over into advertising and consumer behavior and how I ended up in a school of advertising. So I focus, as I said, on I'll just use my computer. So I focus on consumer behavior and how the choices we make in the marketplace, the things that we buy, can have a good or a bad impact on the environment. So here are some images, I think they're quite striking, of what we as humans, what we're doing to the environment. So up here, we have a picture of factory farming in Brazil. Over here we have a picture of a surfer, and you can see in the Pacific Ocean, you can see all of the plastic that he is battling as he's surfing the waves. Down here we have a picture of a bird who has died, and they opened up its stomach, and you can see all of this plastic inside the bird's stomach. The plastic might not have been the original cause of death for the bird, but it's striking to see that much garbage, that much human waste in these animals. Over here we have a picture of the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico by Texas, which is where I live. This was an incident that spewed gas and oil into the Gulf of Mexico for way too long. It became kind of this touchstone point for a lot of individuals. And what I love about these examples is they emphasize how we as consumers are having this impact on the planet. Now, the flip side of that is that we see a lot of advertising telling us to be smarter consumers, basically, to be smarter choices, make smarter choices in terms of what we buy and also how we get rid of it once we're done. So here we have an ad for the WWF telling us that rubbish can be recycled, nature cannot. So a striking image of an animal made out of garbage, made out of our rubbish. Here we have two more. We have Greenpeace. The greatest wonder of the sea is that it's still alive. And then you have all this plastic swimming along as though they're fish. They're not though, they're plastic. Over here, we have the globe, the planet, melting. It's like ice cream, but because of global warming, it's melting. So we have these very powerful images, these striking images that are asking us to reconsider our role as consumers. And sometimes these ads get even more explicit. This is one, I'll read the text at the bottom. If you don't preserve nature by using low wattage bulbs, who will? So it's literally telling us that the solution to these problems is to be a better consumer. We have this animal who's changing the light bulb to the more environmentally friendly ones. So this ad is very explicit, asking us to make smarter consumption choices, to be smarter consumers of the environment. We see, as a result, a lot of consumers are willing to make these changes. Studies have shown that consumers are willing to pay more for green products, like those light bulbs. We're willing to pay more for these things globally. It's about 55% of consumers. In North America, that goes down a little bit to 42%. But younger consumers, millennials, they on average are more willing than older consumers to spend more, and that's promising. In terms of individuals who've purchased green products, environmentally friendly products in the last 6 months, globally, more than half of the consumers have done so. Again, in North America, that's a little lower. In terms of sales, if you are on the marketing side, on the product development side, there's a smart choice to be made in boosting your sustainability, in promoting your sustainability claims. It's supposed to lead to at least a 5% boost in annual sales, and that's a good thing, right? If you're trying to sell your product, you'll be more successful if you add the sustainability element, this green claim to it. And in the States, and it's similar in Europe, there are so many opportunities to be a green consumer. You go to the supermarket, you go to the shelves of stores, and there are so many options as consumers, so many things that we can buy. Sometimes they're a little complicated. For example, here, it's an ad for diapers or nappies, as they might be called in other places. It looks like it's green, right? It looks like it's environmentally friendly. You've got these green leaves. The baby's sitting on this green grass. She looks like such a happy little baby. So you're thinking, that's a green product. That's wonderful. But it's still disposable. It's still a diaper that's going to go into a landfill. Even though it's made of organic cotton, it's still not the best of products to be selling. We've talked about these two examples in the workshop this week, that there are these green products, but sometimes they have these negative consequences, these unintended consequences. Here we have the Prius, the hybrid car. The battery in the car, it's not very durable. It breaks down, and once that battery breaks down, you can't do anything with it, and you have to basically get a new car. So you're taking this first step of being green and environmental, but there might be these unintended consequences where you're not that green. Now we see among American consumers, this is a study that was done of American consumers, that they say they buy into this idea. They say that they want to be green consumers. So this idea of believing that sustainability is important, that's a high number of people. 80% of Americans say, yeah, this is a good thing. I support the idea. But in terms of behavior, much fewer people actually do it. Only 50% of American consumers are willing to be green consumers. So we're seeing this significant gap between people who say they value it, but then people who actually engage in it. And we refer to that as the green gap, this gap between the attitude and the behavior. So if we take the assumption, if we accept the argument that being a green consumer is a good thing and that we want more people to do it, how do we bridge that gap? How do we get people to make those greener choices? And if we break it down, not all green behaviors are the same. If we break it down according to different kinds of green behaviors, some, like taking public transportation or biking or walking, so not using your car, 68% of people, Americans, believe it's a good thing to do, but only 27% of them are willing to do so. Purchasing locally grown food, again, a high number of people supporting the idea. Not all of them actually follow through. Same with using eco-friendly cleaning products. Recycling is a lot higher. It's a lot easier to do. So we see less of a gap here, but there's still room for improvement. So my research takes this focus of if being sustainable is good, if being a green consumer is a good idea, but we have this gap between people who say they value it but then don't follow through on it, how can we sell them on that idea of sustainability? How can we get more people to do these kinds of things? So my focus is on the messaging, on the communication behind it, and I'm going to talk about 3 studies that look at different aspects of it. The first one looks at eco-labels. The second one looks at green claims in advertising. And then this third study looks at the green visuals, particularly infographics. So eco-labels represent, certainly in the North American context, this kind of no man's land or this wild west of labeling. As a consumer, if you go to the store and you're choosing between different products, say a conventional apple versus another apple, they look the same. You're told maybe that this one is better for you, it's better for the environment, it's organic, but you can't really tell just by looking at those apples whether they are in fact different, if one is actually better. That claim of being a sustainable product, it's what we call a credence attribute, that you and I, we can't tell just by looking at it if it really is a sustainable green product. These are benefits or attributes that we can't verify. We would have to go to the farm where that apple is grown. We'd have to talk to the farmer. We'd have to get a lot of information that as consumers, it's really prohibitive. We can't make those kinds of efforts. So instead, we rely on these eco-labels. This is the US Department of Agriculture's organic label. So we look at that label, instantly we accept, oh, okay, it is organic because this other entity has stepped in to tell us it is. And there are a lot of products on the shelves that have various kinds of labels. We have the organic one here. We have the Rainforest Alliance. We have Fair Trade. the leaping bunny, and then we have some that are a little vaguer, grass-fed. Okay, is that good? I think it's good. Cage-free. That sounds good in principle. So as a consumer, I'm going to trust it, I think. And it's actually, in the American context, it's crazy the number of labels that we get on food, on products. This is just a small selection of them. So we look here, we've got the USDA Organic tells us that the food, or the fabric, if it's cotton, for example, is made organically. What about this one, 100% natural product? If you were to see that, what would that make you think? How would you interpret that product? Is it good? Bad? Who knows, right? Who knows? What does it really mean for a product to be natural? Who's testing the product to make sure it's natural? And I mean, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good, right? There are a lot of things that are natural that could kill you and you don't want to take. One of my favorite ones is this one, 100% chemical free. You guys are laughing. What does that mean to be 100% chemical free? Is that even possible? What's that?
In the vacuum of space or something.
You cannot be chemical free, right? We're made of chemicals. That's how we are. That's just what life is made of. It's made of chemicals. So for this label to say that it's chemical free, we're supposed to infer, okay, maybe it's not made with harsh chemicals or chemicals that will hurt you or that are toxic. But that claim in and of itself is just ridiculously over the top. So as consumers, when we go to the marketplace and we're presented with these different labels, some of them feel trustworthy and reliable. Some of them are just nonsense, and some of them are just so vague. How do we actually know what this label is trying to tell us? So I wanted to pursue this. I wanted to see how do consumers process these kinds of labels, the different variety that we have out there. Are there some attributes that are better? Are there some ways of designing a label that are actually worse? So along with a grad student, we did an experiment to look at different elements of eco-labels. And it's important for consumers to trust these labels because really persuasion depends on trust. For that label to work, for it to be persuasive, we need to trust it. We also were looking at elements of source credibility. The labels I showed you on the previous slide, some of those come from US government entities like the organic label. Some of them, who knows where they come from? Who's putting this label out? Are they actually rigorous in their testing? Who do they give it to? Can anyone put this label on their product? And in the States, it's almost like that. Anyone can put a label on their product. We have labels that come from government entities. We have labels that come from NGOs or nonprofits. But we also have corporations that put their own vanity eco-labels or seals on their products. So the source of the label is very important. And then lastly, do these labels help bridge this gap between trust or lack of it and then consumer choices? In the American context, a lot of consumers think this idea of a green label or being green, it's just hogwash. It's a way of selling something. It's buzz. It doesn't actually have any meaning behind it. So we developed a study that was testing this idea of source credibility. Does it matter who is issuing the source? Does it matter what the label is telling us? There are wonderful labels you can get in the EU that have tons of detail to it. Most of the labels in the US, it's just an image, a graphic. So we wanted to look at this idea of argument quality. Does it matter how much detail or specificity is in that label? Do consumers care? We wanted to look at the source. Does it matter whether that label is coming from a government entity or from a corporation? And then lastly, we wanted to look at product involvement because we know from the elaboration likelihood model that involvement is a really important factor. The more involved you are with that decision, the more likely you are to process the information, and it will affect the decision that you make. So we developed two labels, fake labels, for the purposes of the experiment. One label that was just a simple green graphic. This would be a low argument quality label versus another label, which I actually used from an EU version, which is the higher argument quality label. It has more detail to it, more specificity. And then we tested involvement by seeing, is it for a product that you buy it, every day or several times a week, like milk, it's cheap, you don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it, versus something like a smartphone. You're going to buy one, it's going to last you for a year, 2 years, maybe more. You're going to spend more time thinking about it. And then lastly, sometimes the label came from the government, the US government. Other times, the label was issued by what we call a big box store. So Target, are you familiar with Target? The American store that's everywhere. People do a lot of their shopping at a Target. So we predicted that it would be the high argument label, the one with a lot of detail, a lot of information. It would be the government-issued label that would yield higher levels of trust, product liking, purchase intent. And then we looked at how they interacted with product involvement. We thought that it was in the high involvement category that this would matter more, whereas the low involvement category would work with government, the source. And what we found was actually kind of complicated, much more less linear, I guess, than we anticipated. So I don't expect you to process all of this. What I want to bring your attention to is in terms of our dependent variable purchase intent, we found nothing, no significant relationships. It didn't matter who issued the label, didn't matter what it looked like, didn't matter what the product was for. It did not influence purchase intent. We did find some interesting patterns, though, for argument specificity. Across the board, the more detailed argument yielded higher levels of trust, liking, things like that. Things got interesting when it came to the source, whether the source was a government logo or a corporate logo, and then product involvement. And it was an inconsistent interaction. I'll show you what the tables look like. So here we have our product. Milk is this one, the high involvement one, phone. What we find is for the high involvement product, the source doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's corporate or government. It really doesn't have an influence. If you're going to buy a smartphone, that source, that eco label doesn't really give you a lot of useful information. You're probably going to look to other sources of information. You don't care about the environmental record of a phone. You're more concerned about the battery power, the features that it has. But that is very different for milk. We find that it's the government label that is more trustworthy for consumers. They're more likely to look at that source from a government and say, oh, I trust what it's saying. The patterns are the reverse when we're looking at the product attitude. Do you like this product? We find in that situation, again, the high product involvement, there was no significant pattern here. It's entirely among the low involvement product milk. We find that it's the corporate label. The consumers actually, they're more likely to like the product. Same again for attitude toward the source. It's issuing that label. This high product, there's no significant pattern here. It's among the milk that we find, again, the corporate sourced logo. People are more likely to have positive attitude toward that source. And that's kind of the flip of, well, they like the source, they like the label when it comes from the government, but they like the product and the label better when it comes from a corporate source. So that's kind of complicated, and on its face, it doesn't make much sense. The overall takeaway from the study is that none of this influences purchase intent, which, if you remember what I talked about in the beginning, this gap between attitude and behavior, it's significant. And what we find is that this gap holds. People say, yes, I like this label. I like the company that's issuing it. But no, I'm not going to buy the product. So we continue to have this gap between attitudes and behaviors. In terms of the different elements of the label, when we're not taking into account purchase intent, we find argument quality is important. It needs to have detail. Individuals like having more information in that label so they can make choices. When it comes to the source, that's where things get interesting. So there is a main effect. Across the board, government labels are more trusted, but that changes when we take into account product involvement, which ELM tells us should happen. With high involvement products, there's generally very little pattern. It's with the low involvement product that the government label is more trustworthy, but consumers like the corporate labels more, which is odd. But when we think about it, trust is something that is more deeply held. Trust is something that takes a long time to develop. And consumers in the States, they're more likely to trust the government. They've been in the business for a long time of protecting its citizens, so they're more likely to trust that government label. But they like the corporate ones more. Liking is something that's transient, it's flighty, it comes and goes, it's less substantial, less deep. And so consumers are willing to reward corporations, say, yeah, I like what you're doing. I like that you're putting that label out. But note that they're not likely to purchase it. So it's a very interesting non-linear pattern that we're seeing, which really just means I think we need to do more research, which as an academic is wonderful. It means there are more studies to be done. The second study that I wanted to talk to you about is work that I did with another grad student, a different grad student. We were interested in understanding, first of all, how prevalent these green claims are in advertising. And then secondly, well, what did they look like? What kinds of claims are we seeing out there? So we see a lot of ads for green products. This is an ad for the Prius, the hybrid car, set in this beautiful, relaxing, natural scenario. Here we have an ad for tobacco. I'm just going to let you process that one. So 100% additive-free natural tobacco made with organic tobacco and organic menthol. That sounds good, right? That's not going to kill you as fast as your regular cigarette would kill you. No, it will kill you just as fast. But it seems, if you're just looking at this ad quickly, flipping through a magazine, for example, it seems like it's a green, sustainable, environmentally friendly product. It's making these green claims. We can poke at it and say, well, maybe it isn't. But on its face, it's presenting itself as a green product. So we see, certainly in American advertising, these green claims are used widely. I wanted to share a couple of these ads with you. This first one is an ad that appeared during the Super Bowl, which is the biggest advertising event in the States. Huge football game that happens between two teams. Millions of people, more than 100 million people watch this game, and they watch the ads. The ads cost millions of dollars just in airtime to put an ad in the Super Bowl. So I'm going to show you this first one that aired in the Super Bowl. If I can. There we go.
Okay, so it's 3708, paper plastic.
Plastic. That's the magic word. Green police. You picked the wrong day to mess with the ecosystem, plastic boy. Battery! Battery! Let's go! Pick it up! Come on! Put the line down! Sir! That's a composting parachute! Oh! Did you install these bulbs?
Tragedy strikes tonight where a man has just been arrested for possession of an incandescent light bulb.
What do you guys think about plastic bottles now?
The water setting is at 105.
You got a DVI here? Clean diesel.
You're good to go, sir.
Good afternoon, officers. Back to those styrofoam cups you're drinking from? Please step out of the car, put them on the hood.
So I know it's in English and it went fast, but hopefully you got the gist of it. If you're not green, then you're breaking the law, you're doing inappropriate things. Very humorous ad. It was considered one of the winners of the Super Bowl advertising that year. Very well received. So it is an ad for Audi. And the ad itself, it wasn't deceptive, it wasn't misleading. And yet, who else, what other car brand is associated with Audi? Volkswagen, and why would we care? What happened with Volkswagen? I mean, they talk about purposely misrepresenting the green bona fides of that brand. They went out of their way to lie and deceive to the consumer that their car was environmentally friendly. So Audi wasn't necessarily part of that, but they're housed under the same corporate umbrella. So we've got this questionable greenness that we see. Here is another green ad that's even worse in terms of the deceptive green claims.
I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel and I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal, and the storm boss said, well, bless my soul, you load 16 tons. What do you get? Another day older and day through death. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. You load 16 tons.
Imagine if the 250-year supply of energy were right here at home. Now, thanks to emissions-reducing technology from GE Energy, harnessing the power of coal is looking more beautiful every day. Another product of pure eco-imagination. GE Imagination at work.
When you think of coal, you think of sexy Victoria models, right? I mean, in your brain, they're tied together. So GE was trying to sell consumers on this idea of clean coal, that it's this, you know, we have so many stores of it, it's going to be economically viable, environmentally friendly, and then they depict that with these sexy, attractive super bottles. And if you've ever been near a coal mine, you know it's not sexy, it's not pretty, it's not safe, it's very dirty, dangerous work. And when GE put this ad out, they got a lot of pushback from people, especially people from the mining community, saying, this is disrespectful, you're doing a disservice. You know, it does not depict at all the kind of work that we do in the coal mines. So GE pulled the ad, they issued an apology. But it's a useful example for us as students of this idea of green advertising and what kind of claims are being made, because this is a great example of a claim that really is misleading, if not officially, you know, legally deceptive. It is definitely misleading. And it falls into this category of advertising that we call greenwashing. The definition is environmental advertising without environmental substance in other operations of the company. Sometimes it is accidental. Whole Foods Market, which has a huge presence in North America. I believe in Europe, it's just in Great Britain that there are a few stores, although with Amazon's takeover, who knows what will happen. You may have a stronger presence here. But Whole Foods is the major store you would go to for organic, sustainable kinds of products. They were selling a product labeled as organic that actually wasn't. Their excuse was, well, we sourced it from a factory in China, and it was the factory that mislabeled it, not us. So they were engaging in greenwashing, but not on purpose. Sometimes we have greenwashing that maybe it's more of a case of misleading, you know, the claims are true, as we looked at this packaging earlier, but it's not a sustainable product. Throwing diapers or nappies into landfill is not good for the environment, even if it's made of organic cotton. And then lastly, over here, we have more of that willful greenwashing, that legally deceptive kind of claims being made. So along with my grad student, we wanted to explore how prevalent is green advertising and how substantive are the claims. Are they substantial? Are they smart, or are they misleading? So we looked at the advertising in the print, so the magazine, the television, and the websites of these 4 different media channels. So Better Homes and Gardens, Rachel Ray, Martha Stewart, and then Oprah Winfrey. So these are huge media platforms in the States. They have an international presence. We examined them to see how prevalent green advertising is and what kinds of claims are being made. We saw a lot of green advertising. We saw it mostly in magazines, but it was prevalent across all 3 platforms. And across the board, 70% of these claims were superficial. These are claims that have no substance to them. It's the equivalent of saying 100% natural or chemical-free, really no substance or meaning to it that the consumer could say, oh, I know what they're talking about. So the vast majority of them are these superficial kinds of claims. Here we have two examples of what those claims would look like. This is an ad that I showed in the workshop this week. Here you have a woman standing on a windowsill in front of some wooden blinds, and it says, eco-friendly woven wood shades. Well, sure, she's kind of wearing a greenish dress and greenish colors in the ad. Sure, it's eco-friendly. Gives us no real reasons why we should believe that, but it's hoping that we walk away with that impression. Over here we have an ad for Origins, a makeup line. It's nature's alternative to lasers, and we're supposed to infer from the logo and from the mint leaves and the cucumber that it's all natural. It's harnessing the power of the environment. It's almost neutral in terms of any toxicity or impact on us. It's an environmentally friendly product, but again, with no substance or arguments about the green claims. We're getting science about what it will do to our skin, but nothing in terms of the green claims. The other three appeals that we see in the across the channels are ads that might promote an environmental process. So this ad was made with recycled materials. Ads that promoted green behavior, so take a reusable bag when you go shopping. Or ads that promote a green corporate image. We are an environmentally friendly company. And those three appeals were in the minority. The vast majority were these superficial ones. But I'll show you some examples of those other ones. So here we have a substantive, more of a substantive ad making claims within it. This is an ad telling us that the packaging for the snack chips the factory is powered by solar energy. This one is telling us that it uses less water and less electricity while you wash and dry your clothes. So we've got some substance to those claims, but those ones are few and far between. Then we get an ad over here promoting its green corporate image. SC Johnson is saying, we've always been a green company. We've always been this way, not just because it's popular and trendy, we've always been a green company. And this ad over here is worth mentioning because it's hard to see, but down here we have a little logo, a little label from the Sierra Club, which is a very large environmental organization in the States. So as a consumer, we look at this product. It's green, we know, because there's a flower on the packaging. We've got some green grass in the background, but we've also maybe got this kind of third-party endorsement telling us that it's green. Those kinds of appeals that might include some kind of authority, a voice of experience, are very few and far between in the advertising. This was one of my favorite ads that we came across in our content analysis, and I showed this ad in the workshop. It's an ad for a product that is terrible for the environment, disposable, single-use plastic water bottle. But just looking at this ad, if we do just a quick kind of rhetorical analysis of it, it looks so pristine, doesn't it? It looks so environmentally friendly. It looks like it could just blend into nature, just melt into the background. We have this wonderful green, serene setting, no humans in it. It's just entirely the environment. And then it tells us at the top, when it comes to the environment, we're doing less. Now, the smart, savvy consumer says, yes, you are doing less for the environment, but it's almost a play on words, a pun. They're doing less because they're throwing less waste into the environment. It's still wasteful, but what they're telling us is that the cap is dye-free. So if you look at one of these bottles, it has dye in the cap. This one doesn't, so it's better for the environment. It's telling us that the label is shorter, so it uses less paper, and it's telling us that the plastic is thinner. So it's one of those bottles that makes a squishy, crinkly sound. 100% natural spring water deserves an eco-shape bottle. Well, it's called eco-shape. It has eco in the word, right? So it's got to be good. Has an eco-shape bottle that has less impact on the earth. So it seems like a green ad. It's technically not lying because it's truthful, the claims. But if we step back and we say, but it's still not a green product. Now, my grad student and I were curious to know how do audiences process these images? Because, you know, we're experts and we look at it with a critical eye. So we did some focus groups and we asked self-proclaimed green consumers, ethical consumers, what do you think of these ads? And initially, you know, their first response is, oh, that's terrible, it's greenwashing. But as the discussion evolved across all the focus groups, all of them said, but it's okay. I'm okay with this product. On the one hand, they know it's bad for the environment. They know that the claims are a little questionable, but they also say, I'm okay with it. What we see are these consumers basically neutralizing any criticisms they might have. Some individuals said, you know, I rent my house. The tap water tastes terrible. If I owned my house, I might put a filter in there, but I don't. I'm just a renter, so I buy water bottles. Another woman said that she had young kids, and she gave them water bottles because it was better than them drinking Dr. Pepper or Coke or Pepsi. She could just give them a water bottle as they were heading out the door, and so they wouldn't drink soda. And I had several people say, you know what? At least this product is local, because it is drawn from aquifers near Texas, near where we were doing the interviews. So we have a product that is locally sourced, which is good, right? Consumers are supposed to buy things near to where they live so they don't have to travel as far. So we have this wonderful case of greenwashing, but consumers saying, green consumers saying, I'm okay with it. So we found that to be a very interesting disconnect, in our minds, dissonance between their attitudes, their self-professed attitudes, but then justifying these behaviors that aren't necessarily green. Now, the last study that I'm going to talk about, again, continues this idea of how are we communicating green benefits or green information to consumers. And we wanted to look, with another grad student, we wanted to look at this idea of visuals. People process information in different ways. When it comes to information about climate change in particular, so much of it is informative. We see newspapers like the New York Times, magazines like The Economist even, talking to us about climate change. But that's a lot of content to read. It only reaches a certain segment of the population. Are there other ways that we can convey information about the environment, about climate change, that might be better processed? And so we were looking at this idea of infographics. Infographics are, well, they're an increasingly popular way of communicating, but they're certainly not new. Dates back to the cavemen with their cave paintings. This is an example I showed in the workshop. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man is considered to be an early eco-label. You're presenting information through a graphical format. So infographics are useful ways of presenting sometimes very complex information. Can we do that when it comes to climate change? Infographics, as I said, they're seeing an increase in popularity, in part because it is said that we're becoming a more visual society. Our attention span is a lot shorter. We don't have the time to read a lengthy, wordy newspaper article, but we will look at an infographic. They're highly shareable. If you're on your phone and you find one, you can like it on Facebook, you can share it. So in terms of communication, they're becoming much more popular and more accessible. And just to give you some examples of what some look like, this was from the USA Today newspaper. Former president we would most enjoy a burger with. Clinton wins, Bill Clinton, obviously, and then Lincoln, Reagan, and Kennedy. And so we have the burger image telling us kind of the same narrative, the story. Here, I think, is a visually very interesting infographic. What goes into a banh mi, a very popular sandwich in parts of the States. And here we have one that's a little more complex from the New York Times. Are we in the midst of a sixth mass extinction? And there was another story, this infographic is from a while ago, but there was another story that ran this week saying, yes, we are. We are in the throes of a sixth mass extinction, and we are to blame because of it. But this is a graphic that tells us a lot of interesting information about the possibility of this mass extinction. So my grad student and I we wanted to focus on this idea of visual communication. Can we convey complex, detailed information to audiences just as effectively through visuals as we could through a lot of text-driven messaging? And this is actually a response to a call that was made, quite a while ago. Trumbo in '99 said, turning a critical eye toward the functions, purposes, and effects of visual representation in the sciences is really an important thing to do. Part of our approach was to challenge the kind of accepted wisdom of the information deficit model, the idea that, if people just knew, then they'd make smarter choices. If they just knew that climate change was happening, if they just knew what they needed to do, they would change. It's a question of they don't have the information. They have a deficit of information. And we know that's not true. You can tell people information. You can tell them to stop smoking, and they still smoke. You can tell people not to text while they're driving, and they still text while they're driving. It's not a question that they don't have the information. There's something else going on. So we wanted to look at this idea of it's not what is being said. It's not the information itself that needs to be conveyed to the audiences. Rather, it's how we're saying it. How are we telling the audiences the information? Again, we focused on ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, looking at central and peripheral processing. Do visuals, are they processed differently from text when it comes to a message? Is one better than the other? We know that visuals are very powerful forms of communication. This is a wonderful quote from 1922. Lippmann, who was an American writer and political scientist, he said in the 20s, he said, a leader or an interest that can make itself master of current symbols is master of the current situation. If you own the symbol, if you control the visual symbol, you control how people respond to it and how they think about that issue. We know that visuals are processed first, faster, and with more impact on attitude formation and change than text is. If you're looking at a mixed message, it's the visuals that you process first and faster. So we were exploring this idea of what role visuals have, particularly infographics, and then also looking at learning preferences, because people are said to learn either visually or verbally. So our hypotheses were elaboration will be greater, so people are going to spend more time processing or thinking about that content, about that message, will be greater for the infographic than for the text-based message. We thought that this would be particularly true with visual learners, that they would be more likely to elaborate with the infographic, whereas verbal learners, those text-based learners, would be more likely to elaborate with the text-based message. And then we also wanted to know what role does visual literacy play in processing and elaborating. So this is what our experimental stimuli looked like. It was information about recycling. On the left-hand side, it's text-based, just text, just words. On the right-hand side, it's exactly the same information, exactly the same content, but presented in that infographic or that visual format. We pre-tested these to make sure that we were manipulating what we thought we were manipulating. And what we found is that, yes, elaboration was significantly better for the infographic. People spent more time with it. They thought that they processed it more deeply than individuals who were presented with the text-based message. Now, looking at different kinds of learners, we found that, yes, visual learners, they elaborated more with that visual-based message, the infographic. We also found that verbal learners processed more with that infographic. We had hypothesized that verbal learners would be matched better with the text-based message. That wasn't what we found. Instead, we found the reverse. So it's significant, but not in the direction that we hypothesized. Verbal learners process the infographic better than they did the text-based message. So here you have it over here, the text-based message. We have our visual learners and our verbal learners. For both groups, the infographic was more effective. They processed it better. They spent more time mentally with that message. Now, when it comes to visual literacy, individuals who scored high on a visual literacy scale, they also processed the infographic message better. But they did pretty well with the verbal as well, the text-based, pardon me. Those who have low visual literacy actually processed the infographic better than they did the text-based story. So we have this interesting pattern going on. Visuals matter. The way that you present the information, not just what is in that information, but how we're presenting it matters. So we followed this study up, though, with a second study. We wanted to make sure that the findings weren't just kind of an artifact of message redundancy, the fact that maybe the infographic seemed like it had more information in it. So our second study, we isolated the role of visual elements entirely. So we have a text-based condition, entirely text, our infographic, so that combination of infographic with some text, and then a purely visual condition where it's really just the visual element, no text with it. And this was, the message here was about GM foods, genetically modified foods. In the States, there's less consensus about GM foods. Some people don't care, they're not bothered by it. We still have a large segment of the population that is bothered by it. But here in Europe, there seems to be much more animosity toward the idea of GM foods. Not so much in the States. So this is a text-based condition talking about frankenfoods, as we refer to GMO foods, the infographic version, and then this visual like a Frankenstein. The eggplant or the aubergine is becoming a Frankenstein because it's a frankenfood. And we found the same patterns. We found that, or we made the same hypotheses, elaboration would be greater for the infographic compared to the text. And then we wanted to know, well, how do all three compare? Are we seeing differences across all three? Visual learners will elaborate more with the infographic. Based on the previous findings, we said verbal learners will also elaborate more with the infographic. And then what role does visual literacy play? We found the same patterns. Elaboration was greater for the infographic condition than it was for the text, and also for the visual. For our second research question, there was no difference between text and visual, purely text and purely visual. They were elaborated similarly. It was the infographic that really was the condition that saw this boost in elaboration. Visual learners, we posited that they would elaborate more with the infographic. It was in the right direction, but it just wasn't statistically significant, so it wasn't supported. But again, we found that verbal learners did process the infographic more than the text-based one. And then lastly, what role does visual literacy play? We have those findings here. So we have text-based, infographic, and then the visual-based, the purely visual image. We have our verbal learners processing the infographic better than they did with the text-based or just the visual-based. The visual learners, there really wasn't much difference across condition. They processed it, elaborated fairly well across the board. Similarly, in terms of literacy style, the infographic, this is where we see, regardless of your visual literacy skills, it's the infographic that yields more elaboration. So in terms of getting our message across, in terms of communicating what might be very complex information, these infographics are very useful. It's a very effective way for us to get our audience to engage in issue-relevant thinking, to elaborate, to think more deeply and process that content, particularly among verbal learners, so those who we might think would prefer text, and low visual literacy, those people who we might think wouldn't be able to process visuals. So as a result, it suggests that these infographics might actually be a universal way of communicating. It's not that they work better with one audience or the other. They work very well across different kinds of audiences. Compared with the visual-only approach, it's not the volume of information that matters, but the format, how we're presenting it. So it's not the content of that message, but how we are presenting that message. And there are huge implications for message design, huge implications for how we communicate with audiences about climate change, about complicated issues like GMO foods. It suggests that there are a number of ways that we can approach it, and hopefully with more positive outcomes, with more effortful, engaged thinking. So I've given you 3 studies that look at this issue of environmental communication, how we communicate with audiences, different approaches that we might take. and the different consequences of those approaches, sometimes unintended, sometimes in this situation, ideal, the way that we would like to. And I would love to answer any questions or hear any feedback or comments that any of you might have on the research. Thank you very much for listening to me.